In the year 1831, a young man named Charles Darwin stood on the shore of England, looking out at a small ship called the HMS Beagle. He was only 22 years old, with curly hair and curious eyes that seemed to ask questions even when he was silent. He didn't know it yet, but this ship would take him on a journey that would change not just his life, but the way all of humanity understood life itself. At that time, most people believed that every living thing had been created exactly as it was. God made the birds, the trees, the lions, and the humans, and they never changed. Science was still young, and many ideas were shaped by religion. But there were some thinkers, scientists, explorers, and dreamers who were starting to wonder if things were more complicated than that. Charles Darwin was one of those thinkers, though he didn't yet know how much he would come to question everything. The Beagle was not a big or fancy ship. It was a Navy survey vessel, built for exploring coastlines and mapping unknown lands. Its mission was simple on paper: sail around South America, chart the coasts, and collect scientific data. But for Darwin, it would become the start of a great adventure and the beginning of a revolution in science. He wasn't supposed to be on the trip at first. The captain, Robert Fitzroy, wanted a companion, someone educated and polite who could join him during meals and conversations. The job was meant for a clergyman or a nobleman's son, but when the first choice couldn't go, someone suggested Darwin. He wasn't the top student and he hadn't finished his degree yet, but he was interested in nature and had enough money to help pay for the trip. So, after convincing his father, who was not happy about it, Darwin packed his bags and stepped aboard the Beagle. His plan was to be gone for 2 years. In reality, the voyage would last almost 5. As the ship left the port of Devonport in December 1831, Darwin felt both excitement and fear. He had never been on a long sea voyage before. He loved studying plants and animals, collecting beetles, and reading books about geology, but he had no idea what awaited him. The early days of the voyage were rough, not just because of the sea, which made Darwin terribly seasick, but also because of the loneliness. He was far from home, surrounded by sailors who had little interest in science or philosophy. But slowly, he began to find his place. He read books, wrote letters, and started observing the world around him. The Beagle sailed south across the Atlantic Ocean, heading toward Brazil. When they reached the coast of South America, Darwin was amazed. The forests were thick and green, filled with strange birds, insects, and plants unlike anything he had ever seen. He spent hours walking through the jungle, collecting samples, writing notes, and asking questions. Everywhere he went, he saw patterns. Why were some animals found in one place but not another? Why did certain fossils look like animals that no longer lived? These questions stuck in his mind, like seeds waiting to grow into something bigger. But Darwin wasn't the only one watching. The world around him was changing too. Europe was entering a new age of discovery. Scientists were beginning to challenge old beliefs. Explorers were bringing back stories and specimens from distant lands. And technology, like better ships and maps, was making it easier than ever to explore the unknown. Still, the idea that species could change over time was dangerous. Saying that animals evolved was like saying God hadn't made everything perfectly. That kind of thinking could get you labeled a heretic, or worse. For now, Darwin didn't say much. He listened, he watched, he collected. As the Beagle continued its journey along the coast of South America, Darwin climbed mountains, crossed rivers, and met people from different cultures. He studied rocks, fossils, and animals with growing curiosity. Each new experience added another piece to the puzzle forming in his mind. By the time the ship reached the Galapagos Islands in 1835, famous today but barely known then, Darwin was already a keen observer of nature. He noticed that the finches there had slightly different beaks depending on which island they lived on. Some had large, strong beaks for cracking nuts. Others had smaller ones for catching insects. He didn't realize it at the time, but these small differences would later become one of the key pieces of evidence for his theory of evolution. Back on the Beagle, Darwin kept writing. He filled notebooks with sketches, descriptions, and questions. He sent boxes of specimens back to England. Other scientists began to notice his work. They saw promise in the young naturalist who had once struggled to finish his studies. The voyage was hard. There were storms, sickness, and long months at sea. Darwin missed his family. He got lonely, but he also grew stronger, more confident, more determined to understand the world. When the Beagle finally returned to England in October 1836, Darwin stepped off the ship a changed man. He was no longer just a collector of beetles and bones. He was a scientist with a head full of ideas and a heart full of wonder. He didn't know it yet, but the real journey was just beginning. What he had seen on that small ship, the creatures, the landscapes, the fossils, would lead him to ask one of the biggest questions ever asked. Where did all the different kinds of life come from? And the answer he would find would change everything. After leaving the coast of Brazil, Charles Darwin and the crew of the HMS Beagle sailed further south along the edge of South America. Each new place they visited brought more surprises, more questions, and more things for Darwin to study. He was no longer just a passenger on the ship. He had become a true explorer, always walking ahead of the group, always looking down at the ground or up at the trees, always collecting something strange and wonderful. The forests of Brazil were full of life. Bright birds flew overhead, making sounds like music. Insects buzzed and jumped everywhere. Trees were so tall that their tops disappeared into the clouds. Darwin wrote in his notebook every day. He described the colors, the smells, the way the sunlight looked through the leaves. But he also asked deeper questions. Why were some animals only found in one place? Why did some fossils look like animals that no longer lived? And why did some creatures seem almost the same, but not quite, as others from nearby places? These thoughts stuck in his mind like burrs on a dog's fur, always there, always pulling at him. A land of mountains and mysteries. As the Beagle moved farther, south it reached Argentina and Chile. There, Darwin saw landscapes he had never imagined. Vast plains stretched out forever, covered with grass and strange animals like armadillos and guanacos, a cousin of the llama. In the Andes Mountains, Darwin climbed as high as he could. The air was thin and cold, but he kept going. At the top, he looked out over miles and miles of land. It was beautiful, and it made him feel very small. He also found something strange. Fossils. Big shells and bones buried in the rocks high above sea level. How did they get there? At the time, most people believed the Earth was only a few thousand years old. But Darwin started to think differently. Maybe the land itself had moved up over time. Maybe the mountains had once been under the sea. This idea was wild, dangerous even, but Darwin couldn't stop thinking about it. Life in the wild. Darwin didn't just study rocks and fossils. He watched animals closely too. He noticed how the finches in different parts of South America had slightly different beaks. Some had long ones, some had short ones, some had curved ones. They all looked like they belonged to the same family, but each kind seemed built for the food that was available where it lived. He also saw how animals changed depending on the environment. In dry areas, animals were smaller and tougher. Wet forests, they were bright and colorful. In cold mountain regions, they had thick fur or feathers. All these differences made Darwin wonder, could animals change over time to fit their surroundings? Could they adapt? It was a simple question, but it shook the world when he finally answered it. The Galapagos Islands, a puzzle in the ocean. September 1835, after months of sailing and exploring, the Beagle arrived at a group of islands far out in the Pacific Ocean. These islands were called the Galapagos. They were hot, rocky, and strange. Giant tortoises roamed the land, moving slowly like ancient kings. Iguanas swam in the ocean and walked on lava. Birds flew in circles above the cliffs. To most of the crew, the islands were just another stop on the map. But to Darwin, they were a mystery waiting to be solved. He spent weeks walking across the islands, collecting specimens and asking questions. One thing caught his attention right away: the finches. There were many kinds of finches on the Galapagos Islands. They all looked similar, but each had a slightly different beak. Some had big, strong beaks for cracking hard nuts. Others had thin, sharp beaks for catching insects. Darwin didn't realize it then, but these little birds would help him unlock one of the biggest secrets in science. He also noticed that the giant tortoises on different islands had slightly different shells. Some were rounder, some were flatter. Again, small changes, but they made him curious. How did these animals end up on these islands? Did they come from the mainland? And if they did, how had they changed over time? A mind full of questions, back on the Beagle, Darwin sat in his cabin surrounded by jars of insects, boxes of bones, and notebooks full of drawings and notes. He didn't have answers yet, but he had a lot of questions. He started comparing what he had seen in South America with what he had seen in Europe. He began to notice patterns. Animals in similar environments often looked alike, even if they came from completely different parts of the world, and species that lived close to each other were often more similar than those that lived far apart. It was like nature was telling a story, but Darwin wasn't sure what the ending was. He read books about geology and biology. He wrote letters to scientists back in England. He tried to understand what he had seen. Still, the pieces didn't quite fit together. Not yet. The world around him was changing. Too, while Darwin was traveling, the world was changing fast. More explorers were going to distant lands. More fossils were being discovered. More people were starting to ask difficult questions about life, the earth, and where everything came from. Science was growing, so was doubt. People were beginning to question old ideas. Not everyone agreed with them. Some said they were wrong. Some said they were dangerous. But Darwin kept asking questions anyway. He didn't want to make trouble. He just wanted to know the truth. The end of the journey. The Beagle left the Galapagos and continued westward. Darwin still had a long way to go before he returned home. But by now, something had changed inside him. He wasn't just a young man on an adventure anymore. He was becoming a scientist. Thinker. A man who was starting to see the world in a new way. When the Beagle finally sailed back toward England, Darwin stood on the deck and looked out at the endless ocean. He didn't know what he would do next. He didn't know that the notes he had taken and the samples he had collected would one day change the world. But he knew one thing for sure. Life was not the same everywhere. It changed, it adapted, and maybe, just maybe, it had been changing for a very long time. When Charles Darwin stepped off the HMS Beagle in October 1836, he was no longer the same young man who had boarded it 5 years earlier. He had sailed across oceans, climbed mountains, walked through rainforests, and seen animals most people only dreamed about. His notebooks were full of sketches, thoughts, and questions that wouldn't leave his mind. He returned to England tired, but full of energy. He missed the sea, but now there was something more important waiting for him: understanding what he had seen. Sorting the puzzle back home, Darwin began unpacking everything he had collected during the voyage. There were boxes of rocks, jars, of insects, bones, shells, and pages of notes. He sent many of them to scientists in London who could help identify and study them. At first, Darwin didn't know what to do next. He wasn't famous yet. He hadn't made any big discoveries yet, but he had ideas, big ones. As he looked through his notes again, he started seeing patterns he hadn't noticed before, especially with the birds and tortoises from the Galapagos Islands. The finches all looked alike, but their beaks were different. Some were big and strong, some were small and thin. And each kind seemed to live on a different island. Why? What caused those differences? Was it possible that these birds had come from one original group and then changed over time? That thought stuck in his head like a seed in the soil. Talking to other minds, Darwin started meeting with scientists and thinkers in London. One of them was John Gould, an expert on birds. Darwin asked him to look closely at the finches he had brought back. Gould studied the birds carefully and gave Darwin surprising news. These birds were not just different types of finches. They were all new species, and they had all come from the Galapagos Islands. This shocked Darwin. If all the finches came from the same place, why were they so different? How did nature create so many kinds of birds in one small group of islands? The mystery of the tortoises. Darwin also looked at the giant tortoises from the Galapagos. Each island had its own kind, and each had a slightly different shell. Some were rounder, others flatter, like bowls turned differently by the same. And again the question rose, did these tortoises start out the same and change over time? Or were they created separately by God? At the time, most people believed the second idea, that every animal had been perfectly made and never changed. But Darwin was starting to doubt that. A new idea grows as Darwin read books, talked to other scientists, and worked late into the night writing in his notebooks. A new idea began to form in his mind. What if animals weren't fixed forever? What if they could change over time? What if life was always changing little by little? It was a dangerous thought. Saying that animals changed could mean saying that humans also changed. It could mean questioning where we came from, and even the idea of creation itself. But Darwin couldn't stop thinking about it. He remembered what he saw in South America, the fossils of creatures that looked like animals still alive, but not quite, like ghosts of the past. He thought about the way animals lived in different places, how they adapted to their surroundings. He started to wonder, could life survive better if it changed? Could the strongest or best-suited animals live longer and have babies? And could this happen slowly, over many generations? If yes, then maybe. This explained why some animals looked so much alike and yet were different. He called this idea natural selection. It meant that nature itself chose which animals would survive and pass on their traits. The ones best suited for their environment lived longer. They had more babies. Those babies inherited their parents' useful traits. Over time, the whole species could change. Fear and doubt. But Darwin was afraid. He knew what he was thinking was big. Too big. Most people in England believed that God had created the world and all living things exactly as they were. To say otherwise was to challenge religion, science, and society. If Darwin published his idea and was wrong, he could lose everything: his reputation, his friends, maybe even his family. So he kept his ideas quiet. Instead, he spent years studying and collecting more evidence. He read books. He wrote letters to other scientists. He even raised pigeons in his backyard to see how they changed when bred for certain traits. He watched plants grow. He studied barnacles, beetles, and bees. Everything he saw added another piece to the puzzle. A personal loss. During this time, Darwin's father died. Losing him was hard, but it also made Darwin think deeper about life, death, and change. Why did some things die while others lived? Why did some animals survive and others go extinct? What forces shaped the world? He saw the same pattern everywhere. Change over time. Plants changed. Animals changed. Even people changed. Life was not fixed. It was moving, growing, changing. The world around him was changing too. While Darwin worked quietly, the world outside was also changing. More fossils were being found. More explorers were returning with strange animals and stories. People were starting to ask hard questions about the age of the Earth and the origin of life. Science was growing, and so was doubt. Some people were beginning to believe that the world was older than anyone had thought, that life might not have stayed the same since the beginning. But most people still believed in the old ways. Darwin knew that if he wanted to share his idea, he would need proof, strong proof, enough to make even doubters believe. The Seeds of a Theory. By the early 1840s, Darwin had written a long essay explaining his theory. It was full of facts, examples, and careful reasoning. He showed it to a few close friends. Some were amazed. Others warned him not to publish it. It was too controversial, too dangerous, too new. So Darwin waited. He continued studying. He kept adding more facts. He wanted his idea to be unbreakable because once he shared it with the world, there would be no turning back. For years, Charles Darwin worked quietly in his home in the countryside. He had a wife, children, and a peaceful life. But inside his head there was a storm brewing, a storm of ideas too big to stay hidden forever. He had spent over 2 decades collecting facts, studying animals, and thinking deeply about life. He had built a powerful idea, one that could change everything people believed about nature, God, and even themselves. But he was still afraid, because what Darwin had discovered challenged the most basic beliefs of his time. In 1859, after more than 20 years of work, Darwin finally published his book, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. It was a long title for a simple but shocking idea. A book that shook the world. When On the Origin of Species hit the shelves, it caused a huge reaction. People rushed to buy it. Scientists read it with excitement or fear. Priests and church leaders were angry. Teachers argued about it in schools. The book said something very bold. All living things are related. They come from common ancestors, and they change over time through a process called natural selection. This meant that humans might not have been created separately, but instead were part of the same great tree of life as all other animals. That was a dangerous idea. At the time, most people in England believed that God made the world and all creatures exactly as they were. To say that animals, and maybe even humans, had changed over time felt like an attack on religion. Some called Darwin a heretic. Others said he was trying to destroy faith. But many scientists saw the truth in his words. They saw how carefully Darwin had studied nature, how many examples he gave, how much evidence he had collected, and how well his idea explained the patterns seen in animals, plants, and fossils. The Great Debate. Very quickly, Darwin's theory became the topic of heated debates across England, and later around the world. In universities, professors argued late into the night. In churches, priests warned their followers not to believe Darwin's dangerous lies. In coffee houses and newspapers, ordinary people talked about evolution like it was a new kind of war. One of the most famous debates happened in 1860 at Oxford University. A bishop named Samuel Wilberforce stood up and attacked Darwin's ideas. He asked mockingly if Darwin believed that humans were descended from monkeys. Thomas Huxley, a brave scientist who supported Darwin, stood up and replied, "If I had to choose between being descended from a monkey or from a man who uses his gifts to attack science without understanding it, I would proudly choose the monkey." The room exploded in noise. People clapped. People shouted. The debate went down in history. This was the moment when many realized Darwin's idea was not going away. Science takes sides. As the weeks and months passed, more and more scientists began to support Darwin's theory. They found more and more proof that species changed over time. Fossils showed animals slowly changing shape. Studies of birds, insects, and plants backed up Darwin's ideas. Even medical doctors started seeing how bacteria could change and become resistant to treatments, proving that evolution was happening even in tiny living things. But not everyone agreed. Religious groups kept fighting back. Some schools banned teaching evolution. Some books were burned. Darwin himself tried to stay out of the fights. He didn't enjoy arguing. He didn't want to hurt anyone's feelings. He just wanted to share what he had seen and learned. He once wrote, "I feel most deeply that this whole question of creation is too profound for human intellect. Let each man hope and believe what he can." But no matter how gently he spoke, the storm continued. The public learns about evolution. Soon, Darwin's name was known everywhere. Children heard about him in school. Writers made fun of him in cartoons. Newspapers printed wild stories about monkeys turning into men. Some people laughed. Some people cried. Some people thought Darwin was a genius. Others thought he was the devil. But almost nobody could ignore him. Even those who hated his ideas had to admit Darwin had changed the way people thought about life. Before, people believed that every animal was made perfect by God. After Darwin, people started asking, what if life changes? What if we are all connected? What if humans are part of nature, not separate from it? These questions open doors to new ways of thinking, about medicine, about farming, about animals, about ourselves. Darwin keeps working, even as the world argued. Darwin kept doing what he loved best, studying nature. He wrote more books. He studied earthworms, flowers, and how plants grow. He stayed curious. He never stopped learning. He knew that science was not about winning arguments. It was about finding the truth. Even though he was often sick and tired, Darwin kept writing until the day he died. In 1882, Charles Darwin passed away at the age of 73. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, the same place where kings, queens, and great thinkers of England rest. It was a sign that even the church, which had once fought against him, now respected his work. A new way of thinking. By the end of the 1800s, Darwin's idea had become part of science. More and more, people accepted that species change over time. Schools began teaching evolution. Scientists used Darwin's ideas to understand disease, biology, and the environment. His journey on the HMS Beagle, once just another voyage, was now remembered as the start of a scientific revolution. One ship, one man, one idea. Together, they changed everything. When Charles Darwin died in 1882, he left behind more than just books and notes. He left behind a new way of seeing life. The man who once sailed away on a small ship called the HMS Beagle had grown into one of the most important scientists in history. His ideas about evolution and natural selection didn't just change science. They changed everything. People began to see animals, plants, and even themselves in a whole new light. They were no longer separate from nature. They were part of it. A world forever changed in the years after Darwin's death. His theory of evolution became stronger and stronger. More scientists studied life and found proof that species do change over time. They discovered genes. They found DNA. They saw how living things are connected through a great family tree. Even medicine was shaped by Darwin's work. Doctors learned how bacteria can change and become resistant to medicines, which helped them fight diseases better. Farmers used evolution to grow better crops and raise healthier animals. Biologists started protecting endangered species, knowing that every animal is part of a long line of life stretching back millions of years. All of this came from one simple but powerful idea. Life changes over time. And that idea started with one man and one ship. The Galapagos Islands become famous. The islands where Darwin first noticed the strange finches and tortoises became known all over the world. Today, the Galapagos Islands are a protected place. Scientists go there to study animals and learn how evolution works in real life. Tourists visit to see the same giant tortoises and blue-footed birds that Darwin once wrote about. The islands have become a symbol of discovery, learning, and nature's power to surprise us. If you visit the Galapagos today, you'll see signs telling you about Darwin. You'll meet people who study finches just like he did. You'll walk on lava fields where life grows slowly, showing how nature adapts to even the toughest places. It's as if the islands remember the young scientist who once wandered their paths, asking questions that would shape the future. Evolution in everyday life. You might think evolution is something only scientists talk about, but it's actually part of everyday life. When doctors warn about superbugs that don't respond to antibiotics, that's evolution. When farmers plant seeds that grow better in dry weather, that's evolution. When dogs come in many shapes and sizes because humans bred them for certain traits, that's evolution too. Even your own body shows signs of evolution. Your tailbone, it's a leftover from when our ancestors had tails. Your appendix? Scientists think it used to help digest food differently. Your ability to run fast, climb high, or think deeply. All of these traits were passed down through generations because they helped people survive. We are all walking stories of evolution. Science moves forward. After Darwin, science kept growing. New tools let scientists look inside cells and see how life really works. They mapped the human genome, the full set of instructions for building a human being. They found out that humans share a lot of DNA with other animals. Chimps, we're 98% the same, mice about 85%, even bananas, we share some genes with them. This shows how connected all life is. We may look different, but deep down we all come from the same source. Darwin's idea helped make sense of all this. Without him, modern science wouldn't be where it is today. Education and debate even. Though Darwin's theory is now accepted by nearly all scientists, not everyone agrees with it. Some people still believe that life was created exactly as it is today. This has led to debates in schools and governments. In some places, teachers are told not to teach evolution. In others, students are encouraged to learn about both science and religion. But most scientists agree, evolution is not just an idea. It's a fact, supported by fossils, DNA, and thousands of studies. That doesn't mean it answers every question about life, but it gives us a powerful tool to understand how life began and how it keeps changing. The ship that started it all, the HMS Beagle, the small ship that carried Darwin around the world, is now remembered as one of the most important ships in history. It wasn't the fastest, it wasn't the biggest, but it carried a thinker whose ideas changed the world. Today, people study the Beagle like a piece of scientific history. There have been efforts to find its remains. Some say it sank in a river in England. Others hope to dig it up and preserve it. Either way, the ship lives on in stories, books, and museums. Because of it, a young man got to explore the world, and because of that young man, the world saw itself in a new way. A new kind of thinking. Darwin's work also changed how people think about nature. Before, many believed that humans were above nature. Now, we know we are part of it. We depend on clean air, fresh water, and healthy forests. We share this planet with millions of other species, and if we destroy their homes, we may also hurt our own. This thinking has led to the rise of environmental science, wildlife protection, and climate action. Many of today's green movements owe a debt to Darwin. He showed that life is not fixed. It changes, and so must we. The man behind the theory, Charles Darwin, was not a loud or flashy man. He was quiet, thoughtful, and often sick. He spent much of his life working, at home surrounded by books and nature. He loved studying earthworms, flowers, and barnacles. He raised pigeons in his backyard. He watched bees and wrote poems about vines. He was curious about life in all its forms, and he never stopped asking questions. Even as the world argued about his ideas, Darwin kept doing what he loved. Best learning, observing, thinking, writing. He once said, "The love of science is a strong feeling," and that love drove him to change the world. One ship, infinite ripples. So what does it mean? How did one human ship change everything? Because on that ship sailed a man who looked closely at life, who asked hard questions, who dared to think differently, and who gave the world a new way to understand itself. From that journey came a theory that shaped biology, medicine, farming, and even space science. From that journey came a deeper respect for nature, and from that journey came a reminder: big changes can start with small steps, great ideas can come from quiet minds, and one person, with curiosity, courage, and care, can truly change the world.